Hello. So I wanted to take an opportunity to talk with you guys about the end of the novel because we hadn't had a chance to do that. And it's such an amazing ending, and we've made this journey together. And I just wanted to make sure we finished it and that you guys understood all the complexity and depth that Dickens embeds into the text, especially with everything coming to fruition at the end. So, we're largely going to be having this conversation around this main theme that Dickens has been establishing throughout, which is resurrection, and this new idea that he introduced in book two, that resurrection comes only with sacrifice. And we see this at the end, especially with the heart wrenching, beautiful, amazing way he closes the novel, and that is Darnay being saved from death, Darnay being resurrected. But this can only happen with Sidney Carton sacrificing himself. And this is made very clear with Dickens' chapter title for 13, which is 52. 52 must go to the guillotine, right? Any less would raise suspicion. So someone must die in Darnay's place if he is to live. So how does this happen? Well, you guys guessed it. They need to switch places. Sidney Carton needs to take Darnay's place. He has to switch clothes with him, and then he drugs Darnay while Darnay writes a letter to Lucy. So this is what he picked up at the chemist shop back in chapter 9. And this letter that he writes to Lucy, partly it is practical, right? So he being Sidney Carton, needs to distract Darnay. If he just walked in there and told Darnay, hey, take off your clothes, put on mine, you're leaving, I'm staying, we've already seen from the way Darnay behaved multiple times in the novel that he would not have gone for it, right? So the only way he can get Charles Darnay to agree to this is if Charles Darnay is not aware of what is happening. I mean, this is the guy who goes to France, a country who is besieged by revolutionaries in order to save Gabelle. So Sidney Carton is smart. He knows that he needs to basically trick Darnay into this. And so he tells him that he's there to have Darnay write one last letter to Lucy. And we see this on page 349. So I'm going to turn there with you guys. So on 349, the prisoner looked up. This is about a fourth down the page. At each question, Carton, standing over him with his hand in his breast, looked down. If you remember, said Carton, dictating, the words that passed between us long ago, you will readily comprehend this when you see it. You do remember them, I know. It is not in your nature to forget them. He was drawing his hand from his breast. The prisoner, chancing to look up in his hurried wonder as he wrote, the hand stopped, closing upon something. So this letter here is meant to distract Darnay while Sidney Carton gets out the chloroform, the drug that he's going to use to knock him out. However, there's another purpose for this letter. This letter is the reminder of his promise to her, being Lucy, that he would give his life for a life she loved. And so this letter is not actually Darnay's letter to Lucy. This letter is Sidney Carton's farewell letter to Lucy that Darnay will carry for him. And it's his way to tell her that what he does out of love. He does because he wants to help her. He does because he promised that if he ever had the ability to do something good for her, he would. And so he's trying to remind her here of this promise that he made. Now, on 351, we see that the drug has taken effect, and Darnay here is the unconscious figure, and Barsad and Sidney Carton helped to carry him away and put him in the carriage. All of this was foreshadowed or hinted at by Dickens. This largely works because Dickens established early on that these two men are doubles. It works because they're doppelgangers. So this word doppelgangers is a really great German word, and it means double walkers. And actually we see this concept of doppelgangers, of these doubles, a lot in Victorian literature. So because they're doppelgangers, because they look alike, Sidney Carton is able to save Darnay. He's able to take his place. And Dickens prepared us for this, right? Because this taking of his place, because they look alike, is in some ways a double of Carton saving Darnay in Book the Second in the English trial. So Carton was able to save Darnay in the trial in Book 2 largely because he pointed out that they looked alike. And this was hinting at this future event, the real trial where the circumstances were truly life or death here at the end with France. Dickens also foreshadowed this with the promise that Carton made to Lucy in Book 2, Chapter 12, A Fellow of No Delicacy, right? And then we just read how he reminds her of that promise again in Book 3, Chapter 11, when he whispered in her ear, a life you love, and then again here in the letter that he has Darnay write. And then another great way Dickens foreshadowed this was the conversation that Sidney Carton had with Mr. Lorry and his behavior in Chapter 9, The Game Made. So on page 308, he's talking to Mr. Lorry, and he mentions that I have done nothing good or serviceable. This is Sidney Carton basically saying here that my life has been a waste, which we know is true. He is someone who does little more than drink and work for Stryver, doing all of his dirty work. And so he says to Mr. Lorry, if this were the case, your 78 years would be 78 heavy curses. And then on the next page, he says, my young way was never the way to age, suggesting that his way of life is not one that is conducive to old age. And that this word curses, he doesn't want to continue this way. So we see here him foreshadowing that he's going to do this, but also the reason why he does this. Taking Charles Darnay's place gives Carton's life, this life that has been nothing good or serviceable, purpose. His reason for doing this is it gives his life reason. And it makes his life suddenly worthwhile. This life that he felt has been completely wasted suddenly has some meaning in it. And the last really great way that Dickens foreshadows this is page 311 to 313, again in Chapter 9, where he's wandering the streets of Paris, and he keeps reflecting on this quote from the Bible, I am the resurrection and the life. So he hints here that he's contemplating death because this was the passage read at his father's funeral. And so the fact that he's thinking about it suggests that he's thinking about death, his own death. And this particular passage also connects him to Jesus. He, like Jesus, will save through his sacrificial death. And this passage in Chapter 9 on page 313 that we'd already looked at becomes even more meaningful when we think about it in this context. So I want to turn back. Page 313, actually the very bottom of 312. He is looking out at the river. The glorious sun is rising. We have this beautiful pathetic fallacy here, very different from what we saw in Book the Second, The Jackal, with the sad sun rising. Now we have a glorious sun rising. This sacrificial death that he's contemplating is going to bring him this glorious rebirth. And he looks out at the river. The strong tide, so swift, so deep and certain, was like a congenial friend in the morning stillness. He walked by the stream far from the houses, and in the light and warmth of the sun fell asleep on the bank. When he awoke and was afoot again, he lingered there yet a little longer, watching an eddy that turned and turned purposeless upon the stream, absorbed it, and carried it on to the sea, like me. This eddy here is a small stream of water. And he watches as it turns purposeless at first, but then gets absorbed by the sea. So we see here, again, Dickens is so purposeful and so thoughtful with his language. He has been continually talking about the Revolution as the storm and the sea. And we see that Sidney Carton here is realizing here that by giving himself up to the sea, he is the eddy, right? Watching the eddy, like me, by giving himself up to this water, to the sea, which is the Revolution, his purposeless life will gain meaning. Oh, it's amazing. Okay, we're going to pause here, and I'm going to come back with the next section, which is how through this sacrifice, not only does he resurrect Darnay, but he also resurrects himself.